Today, I'm going to talk about how to set up training zones with power. 5.33 miles, 8 minutes, 55 seconds per mile, 144 beats per minute, and 200 watts on average for today's run on some relatively hilly terrain, which I thought would be a good time to talk about training with power and how to set up your power zones. But before I get into my discussion on that, I do want to go over some disclaimers and disclosures. In terms of disclaimers, I'm not a coach. I'm not certified to be a coach. I'm not anyone's coach. If you have questions, ask your coach, and I would defer to your coach on that. I'm just a dude that runs a lot, and I've been running with a power meter, either this Stryd foot pod or the Grit X, for a couple of years now. And that leads me to the disclosures. The Grit X is a watch that was provided to me for the purpose of review, so I didn't have to pay for it. The Stryd foot pod is something that I purchased with my own money. No one sent it to me. But in either case, no one's going to be paying me to make this video to include their devices, and no one's going to get a chance to preview any of my thoughts or footage before you guys get a chance to see this video on YouTube. So with all the disclaimers and the disclosures out of the way, let's talk about training with power. First, I want to talk about why do you want to train with power, or what is power? The way I think about it is it's a measure of your intensity, like how harder is your body working. And the idea or the use case for it is, let's say you are running a half marathon or a marathon and you want to shoot for 7.5 minutes per mile the entire time on average. That's pretty easy to do if you have a flat course. What do you do when it's hilly? Do you still run that same intensity at the same pace, 7 minutes, 30 seconds per mile up the hill? Or is that going to be making you work too hard, causing you to blow up before the race ends? Or do you still run 7 minutes, 30 seconds on the way down, potentially losing some of that downhill benefit and costing you extra energy when you could have had a little bit of a free ride on the downhill? So the idea with the power meter is that it helps you figure out a way to train at the same level of intensity. So even though you're slowing down a little bit going on the uphills, you're picking that back up on any of the downhills, and otherwise keeping a consistent level of exertion throughout your race, which is as close as you can get to completely emptying the tank without blowing up before the race ends. So that's kind of like the idea. The way it works is there's accelerometers and other things in here that detect like how your body is moving. And so at least with the Stryd foot pod, another benefit that you get from it is that it's very accurate in terms of your pace and distance, which is useful for me, even though I do have a GPS watch that I really like. If I'm running in an urban area or any other area where satellite signals are not so reliable, I don't have to worry about that. My pace and distance numbers aren't GPS based. The other reason that I am interested in training with power and or racing with power is that the feedback is instantaneous. Like as soon as you change and pick up the pace from one pace to another, like say you're going from an off session to an on session in a fartlek, it immediately picks it up. With heart rate, there's a little bit of a delay. There's always kind of a delay in terms of like what your body is currently doing at this moment and what your heart rate is doing. Your heart rate is always kind of like catching up to your level of exertion or slowing down to it, and it's never instantaneous. So this gives you a little bit more of an instantaneous level of feedback, which I think is useful for shorter intervals, more intense intervals where the amount of time that you're in your on is going to be a lot shorter, and when also you're looking for hitting a very specific level of exertion. So here are the two devices that I have that measure power. The Stryd foot pod, this pairs with your watch or your phone, and it gives you that power data during the run. It clips onto the front of your shoe. You might have seen it in any of my other videos. I have it on my shoe pretty much every time. The other way of measuring power is wrist-based power, which I think is a little bit newer. This one is from Polar. It's the Grit X. The Vantage V also gives you the ability to get power from the wrist. I find that it's pretty reliable. It's surprising. This, I think, uses accelerometers in terms of how hard your foot is hitting the ground because it's attached to your shoe. But without doing that, the Polar Grit X, I feel like gives me really accurate results. I haven't done a super statistical analysis on it, but from my kind of anecdotal use, it seems pretty good. The only difference or only thing to keep in mind is that the numbers won't be the same. So like when I get a 200 watts on this device, it's not the same as 200 on this device. On the Grit X, the numbers all seem to be higher by a pretty standard constant. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but it's all like if I measure the two graphs from the same run, the graphs would look the same. They would just be at different heights in terms of what the power are. So that's just something to keep in mind. But that's the devices that I get the power from. And so then how do I then use that power? So the way that I'll look at it, we looked at paces and we looked at heart rates in terms of like how to set up your easy runs, what should your threshold runs kind of look like in terms of your pace or your heart rate, and then what your intervals and what your repetitions look like. So we can do kind of the same thing with the power meters as well. The easiest way to do it is with Stryd. And the way that Stryd works is you run with it ideally for at least 90 days, but I think you can start getting some of these numbers right away, or you can start working with power right away. But it really starts to learn you over time, and that's when the device and the data becomes much more valuable. And what it does is it will give you what it calls the critical power number. And that critical power number will adjust itself, not on a periodic basis, a scheduled basis, but based on changes in your training. And so just 2 days ago, because my training has differed quite a bit leading up to a 30-mile race and after the 30-mile race, my critical power number adjusted. But what that critical number corresponds to is your threshold pace. So that point where you're going from anaerobic to or aerobic to anaerobic, an important kind of demarcation point in a lot of training regimes, whether you're training by pace or you're training by heart rate. And so that number for me was 263, but now it's 249. And so I'll set that up as like kind of like the upper limit for my threshold run. So if I'm doing a threshold run, say like 5 times 6 minutes with 2 minutes rest as part of kind of like a weird fartlek, that's something that I would do. And the way that I would run is I would set it up on my watch. So that way I can look at it and see what that power number is at any point and try to stay right in that 249 range. So for my current critical power, if it was a couple of weeks ago when my critical power was 263, I would run with the power shooting for 263 during those threshold segments. That's the power number that I'm going to be running for. What pace does that correspond to? I don't care. It doesn't matter because whether I'm running uphill, whether I'm running downhill, as long as I'm hitting that number, that means that my legs, my entire body is working hard enough to get that benefit that I'm looking for. And so it's really nice if you live in an area that is a little bit hillier. Like here, there isn't really a lot of flat. There's a lot of gentle ups and gentle downs, but nothing that's very flat. It makes it easier that I don't have to plan a route along, where are the areas where are going to be more flat, because that way I can figure out my training better. I can just go out and run, and when I need to run, I can run and just hit the power number, and the pace is whatever it is. Then also in the Stryd Power Center, in addition to giving you that critical power number, it will set up the zones for you. The way that I like to look at it, they use, I think, a 5-zone system. And for me, I only train with kind of 4 zones that I'm interested in. Easy, your threshold pace, your intervals pace, and your repetitions pace. And like threshold, intervals, and repetitions, they get faster as you go down that list. For the most part, I spend most of my time in the easy zone, and Stryd will give you that number based on your critical power. And so it sets up those zones for you. So you kind of just copy paste and figure what those are. I put those numbers into my polar watch. So that way I can, if I want to run with power, have that power number show up and it'll tell me kind of like which zone I'm in if I want to stay in a zone. On that note, I will say that not every watch can work with a Stryd power meter. I would check their website. They have a support page. I'll post a link to it in the description, which says which watches it's that support using a power meter. I think for a lot of it, so the cheaper watches that don't support it, and mainly that's because, mainly because of firmware, and there's just no way to configure data fields that have power in it. I mean, even those watches that you can configure some of your data fields, there just isn't an option to add a power data field. And so not all watches can give you that power number, so that's something to be aware of before you dive into this. But you get your easy zone, and my easy zone is set at 199. So today's run of about 201 watts is a little bit on the high side for easy, although compared to my critical power of a couple of days ago, it's squarely in the middle of easy. Not a huge deal. As I ramp up training again, that number will adjust and it'll automatically kind of take care of itself. At threshold, that's that 249. So anywhere around that 249 or lower, then I'm doing like a threshold run, like within the vicinity, and it'll give you that range in the Stryd Power Center. For my intervals, which I consider to be like around 5K pace for intervals, things that are a little bit shorter, like about a half mile or shorter for those intervals, I'm looking at all the way up to 287. And then for repetitions, which I would consider like mile pace, for repetitions, really, really short stuff, 400 and 200s and shorter, that's going to be above 287. I never like to say the units, but it lists it as watts, but above 287 is the number that I'd be looking for if I'm using the Stryd foot pod and using Stryd's numbers. Now, if I have just the Polar Grit X, it gets a little bit more tricky because the Grit X, not yet anyway, I'm hoping that's something that's coming. It doesn't kind of auto-populate what your numbers should be. I think the other way to do it, if you don't have the benefit of the Stryd foot pod, which the Stryd foot pod takes a look at just all of your running and can really get a comprehensive look at what your training is really like, it eliminates the temptation to kind of cherry pick values, which is something that I think a lot of runners have a tendency to do when setting up your like training zones. But the way that you would do it, I think for if you're using just the Grit X, is going to be relying and kind of like backfilling with pace numbers, and then adjusting and tweaking from there as you have some more experience with it. So what I mean by that is like how would you figure out an easy pace if you're training by pace is by running conversational and kind of seeing what the average power number you're getting from the Grit X would be and kind of setting that as your limits for your easy running zone. Then for threshold, how I would set up a threshold pace zone would be by looking at a time that's somewhere in between your half marathon race pace or your current half marathon fitness and your current 10K like fitness if you were out to go out and like run one like in the next couple of weeks. Find a pace that's somewhere in the middle of that, test that out and see what your power number is. If you can run somewhere relatively flat, that is what I would set for your threshold number. For your intervals, I would do the similar thing, like figure out what a good 5K race pace would be. If you have a recent 5K race and you wore a power meter for that, I would take that number as that's the average from that and put that in as your intervals number. And then similar, you can go out and do a mile time trial and figure out what your power number is there. And that would set up your zones. And then just like with power or with heart rate or even with paces, periodically through the course of your training cycle, you should be like evaluating and adjusting, saying, do I need to tweak my heart rate zones? Do I need to tweak my pace zones? And do I need to tweak my power zones? That's something else that you could be doing. With Stryd, it kind of does it for you. You'll get a notification that your critical power has updated, and then you can go and check and change any of your zones. So that way the next week's or the next workout, you can be working at the new correct, quote unquote, level of intensity. So those are my thoughts on how you would set up and use power to fill into your training plan. I'm assuming that you have some sort of training plan that says, like Monday, easy long run, Tuesday, 3 times 6 minutes at T for threshold with 2 minutes rest. Now you know how hard to kind of work those. So those are my thoughts on how to set up zones if you're going to train by power. Let me know in the comments if you have any other questions. I'll try to answer them the best that I can. Thanks so much for everyone for making it all the way to the end of this video. Hopefully you guys are staying safe out there on your runs, and I'll see you in the next one.
Yo, what's going on?